Welcome, Jamie. We agreed with you to talk about critical national infrastructure, contested supply chains, and the next front line. So I would start by asking you, what is this mysterious next front line, and what is the battlefield, and where are the emerging threats there?
It really is the front line that I think we ignore. We're so focused, and understandably focused, on the bravery of the Ukrainian front line that we overlook, I think, where some of our greatest and most emergent critical dangers sit. I mean, for 40 years, really, 50 years since the end of the Second World War, we've assumed that global trade is a given. It's rules-based, the World Trade Organization, big global multinationals with factories in all sorts of parts of the world have existed very, very efficiently and successfully. And I think that's really under threat, that those assumptions are being challenged. And I think it's fair to say that whereas efficiency and cost have been the sources of operational advantage, they're now becoming our weakness. So the cost of materials leads you to China. The speed that you can obtain materials can be disrupted. And so that really, as we move into this new era of economic competition, I think we're really looking at how we manage the risks that are emergent and these complex interdependencies. They're almost too complex for any human to cope with. And we can talk about sort of digital analytics and the role that plays. But I think that it's the front line because we're now in an age of economic competition, and we have real vulnerabilities that are now emergent across our infrastructure and across our supply chains.
Yes. So what kind of sectors are most impacted by this? What do you think?
So I don't think there's any sector that's free of this. And I'll tell you for why. I mean, at a very small level, we have examples in the UK of very, very small companies whose IP has been stolen through cyber attack. And that they have now collapsed economically. Now, does that have a strategic impact? No, it doesn't. But it has a real impact both on the value of that company and that business, and it's a real personal loss, but it's also a loss in terms of jobs and our broader economy. Right up through, I think we can safely say, to a different example and a recent example in September 2024, where the Israeli military took on Hezbollah, looking at supply chain and penetrating its supply chains to devastating operational effect. So there's no area of modern life that isn't contested in terms of the supply chain. We all depend upon our supply chain, upon the resilience. But I'd say that if we as countries have to think about this, then we need to think about it in terms of our critical infrastructure, our water supply, our electricity supply, our telecoms supply. The things that we all rely upon have to be protected, and they have to be resilient.
Yeah, actually, we had in Estonia one case recently discussed in our newspapers where this Ukrainian war made us improve our supply chains. But generally, if you think about what are most significant vulnerabilities of these supply chains and how these are intersecting with our national security concerns.
Yeah, so I think it comes back to this question of complexity, is we really don't know what we don't know. And if you think about it, the age of electronics has made those interdependencies even more complex. Internet of Things, everything from our fire extinguishers to our cars, to everything is interconnected now. And actually, so you need to think of it in terms of complex systems. And systems can be disrupted, and we don't understand systems. So there might be a critical dependency. So, for example, I understand that 80% of the car industry relies on one manufacturer for crocodile clips. Small, irrelevant in many ways, not irrelevant, but small, sort of low technology, low cost products. But if that factory were disrupted, it would have potentially a significant impact upon the car industry. So I think we have to think about this in terms of really understanding the layers of risk, and thinking through how we manage and map and cost risk, because our risk models are analog, and you can look at the internet, how people think about risk. They're products of compliance, really. They're not risk management, and I think we have to understand. If I can offer some thoughts on this, we've been doing a little bit of work with a technology startup that I work with called Darkscope, and we talk about 7 factors of risk in the supply chain. And they may all individually be small, but actually the cumulative effect can be very significant. So we talk about criticality, for example. In terms of national security, rare earths are a critical function. So F-35, for example, has something like 15 rare earths or some such figure. All our drones in Ukraine and here on the front line are depend on neodymium, which 70% is mined by China, and 95% of magnets are manufactured in China. So we have a heavy critical dependency, criticality risk on China for magnets and therefore electric motors. Bad actor risk, the hostile risk of someone infiltrating your supply chain or your infrastructure. That could be a criminal, but it can also be hostile state actors. And we've seen that. What do we say? Operational risk, the flawed financial models, or a company is just weaker than you might think it is. We can think about geopolitical risk, sanctions. All our graphite that we depend on for steel manufacturing is dependent on China. Vulnerability risk, counterfeiting, factories that infiltrate, or our food supply chain with fake products that cause harm. Transit risk, the Suez Canal being blocked. So when the Evergreen in September 21 found itself sitting across the Suez Canal, that cost us $9.6 billion every day in global trade for 6 days. And then theft risk, and we've seen this very clearly in a US transportation company that we work with, where significant percentages of shipping material is being stolen, and companies right across the UK and Europe are suffering similar harms. So it's about really starting to both map your supply chains in a world of complexity, and that is not simple. And then understanding that at each sort of node, what the risks associated with that are.
Yeah. So the picture you painted is very complex, and it is truly. What do you think, what can the governments do? Because you mentioned sanctions already, which are deliberate, right? But, it's also difficult for the governments to manage this scope.
Yeah, and I think, to be honest, I think where we sort of outsource our risk to government, we run real risks. The government has a role, and it has a role to some stage in the regulatory space. So, for example, it's probably only governments that could force the raw materials away for steel production away from China, for example, by tariffs or by some sort of regulatory thing, and allow Europe to have some sort of independent steel manufacturing. But generally speaking, I think as a rule, where we've just used regulation as a means of managing risk, we found companies work to the regulation and not to the risk, and they've not understood the risks that they're facing. And I would advocate a more an approach which starts to cost risk. So and this is hard, but we've been doing it for generations. I mean, way back to sort of early medieval times on insurance and shipping. It's not new. But I think in a modern age, it is clear to me that companies do not understand the risks they're taking. We have a generation of procurement specialists who are very, very good at moving the cost of material down and buying low, and they know how to ship it across the globe, but they are unaware, and chief executives of large companies are unable to map the risks associated with that decision. And consequently, you've seen this very recently with JLR on a cyber attack, where a very efficient, highly innovative company has suffered billions of catastrophic damage because of a simple oversight in their cybersecurity, and we believe, or NATO believes, that the Russian actors were involved, that's had not only a very significant impact on that company, but on the supply chain and the companies that depend upon them as a supplier. So the economic damage is almost unmeasurable, but is very significant. That's jobs, that's tax, that's the people being able to go to work in the morning, has all been placed at risk because of a lack of resilience in that company's infrastructure.
Yeah. We can continue our talk about risk and innovation later, as we have an innovation panel, right? But for now, thank you, Jamie.